Okay, so today we're going to see if we can finish up this wider section on spiritual discernment. We've been on this for quite a while now. It's a rather important section for us as Christians because we have all these decisions we have to make in our lives, both day to day, smaller stuff, but also as we've seen the last several weeks, in like some pretty big choices. Like career, marriage. What our spiritual gifts are and what our roles and responsibilities in the church should be, things like that. So the two areas that we didn't get to, because even though that isn't an official section here, last week we spent a lot of time talking about spiritual gifts and ministry areas. So both Audie and I talked some about how we came to decide on the things that we decided on, and like the process for that and things like that. But this week, we're going to see if we can finish these last couple here. So this section on great matters, right? And then this section on ministry and relations with other believers. So as has been the case, as we've gone through this, I have pulled out some stuff for us to talk about. We can also, of course, refer back to the document. The Ichthus study has, more direct quotations of scripture that we can look at. But I really like this first paragraph here. As I text probably a little bigger over here. I quoted most of it directly just because, it's a very good brief for the issues that a lot of people have getting hung up on politics or wars or, the injustices present in our world that are inevitable because this is Satan's world kingdom, right? Satan's cosmos.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I'll read the whole thing here like out loud, but just this idea that humans have this tendency to think that we can solve the problems, if not ourselves personally, then as long as we convince enough other people, then we can go out as a group and fix. Well, actually, that's something further on down here. But people are arrogant. A lot of the time we sort of reserve the word arrogance for someone who's just like being snobby about it. But if you think about it, anytime we as these very finite humans, there's billions of people on the world, who are we to think that we know best about how this should be or how that should be? Dr. Luginbill in this first sentence here just compares it to the smallness of the earth in general relative to the scope of the universe. So there's the general human frailty, how small humans are relative to Earth, but then just also consider like how minute Earth is relative to the total volume of the universe. Or just the sun, for example. If you've ever seen a scale model of the solar system, the Earth is really puny compared to the sun. And the sun's not even that big a star, relatively speaking. But that doesn't stop us from, as Dr. Luginbill said, planning, plotting, and opining on great things all the time, right? Things that if we reflected for the briefest moment and with the tiniest smidgen of humility, we would realize are completely out of our control and beyond our ken, right? And in fact, this describes quite a bit of what people end up spending their lives worrying about, right?
Yeah.
So politics, I have to come look and see how explicitly it gets mentioned in this section. Politics is included here, right? Here we go. The discussion on democracy here, right? Everyone and their dog has political opinions and are not shy about sharing them, and so we are constantly bombarded on social media sources in general, TV, friends, family. Everyone is telling us, oh, you should think this or you should think that. And actually, now, of all times we could be having this discussion on these great matters, now is not a bad time. We think about all the things going on in our world right now. So, we're speaking here in late September of 2020. And so we've had the COVID pandemic that's severely affected the global economy, as well as just, geopolitics in general, right? The relations between the United States and China. What else has been going on? It's election year here in the United States. So, that happens every 4 years for us in the presidential election, and with all of the campaigning and the politicking that goes along with that. And, it's been economically very turbulent. A lot of people have been out of work because of the COVID pandemic. And so, people have been unemployed, and there's been a lot of tension here in the United States, at any rate, based on the cases of police brutality, the racial tensions in our country. All of these things have been simmering. We have lots of great matters, so to speak, that are sort of, always on this constant boil, the background noise of the world, if you will. And, like this paragraph says, it can be really hard, particularly those of us living in a democracy where, it's commonplace for everyone to talk about political opinions and feel like it's maybe not only a good idea, but even a duty or a responsibility for citizens of a country to participate in politics. No, I guess what I was getting at with the whole tangent I just went on is that, like, we certainly live in interesting times, right? As the saying goes. So there's a lot that we could potentially spend our time worrying about. But the whole thrust of this section, as Dr. Luganville outlines it, I mean, and as of Scripture's perspective in general, is that, we're not of this world. Our kingdom is of a different world. And so we just don't really need to concern ourselves with, the trajectory of humanity, as it were, right? Like, where is the human ship pointed? Like, it's just not a concern, because we know that that's God's problem, right? God's the one who steers the nation boundaries, right?
Yeah.
So yes. Here.
Okay. Daddy Dindo, I'm waiting for you.
No. Go for it. I'm enjoying the read.
Okay. Well, I think this.
I guess maybe it's also because you and I have had this discussion. It's just articulated more on the atheist sides.
Yeah.
And this was one of our first discussion years ago.
Yeah.
Where, yeah.
We discussed at length about it. Was quite a debate. I think it was one of the last discussions I had on the grinder before we got off. So on great matters, we're still talking about the matter of discernment, sort of, because being able to tell when you're responsible to engage and when you are responsible to disengage. For example, every time I've said things like Christians ought not to be involved in politics, there's that question of, well, you just let the government do whatever they want, you let evil people rule, and so on and so forth. Don't you have some sort of responsibility? Of course you do. You pay your tithes. They call you on jury duty, you go, you keep the laws, you don't break the laws. And basically do act like a decent human being who has respect for
such a high bar, isn't it?
Yeah. Funny thing is, it's a pretty low bar in the eyes of many. It's too low. How can you be so docile about everything? Go higher, fight the system,
No.
and so on and so forth. That's
the argument as it typically goes, as I've heard it put forth, particularly by some of the more alarmist contingents in the conservative Christian faction, is that, well, if we don't, like lobby and have all these political rallies and stuff, fighting against, say, abortion and homosexuality and transgender stuff, that's currently, these are all hot button political issues in our time, right? Well, if we don't go mobilize the Christian masses against these things, well, doesn't that mean that our government's going to legislate things that are not moral? And so the problem is that really it doesn't matter too much what the government says. So adultery has been illegal in sometimes in places, right? If you're familiar with the novel called The Scarlet Letter, right, that was a dealing with the idea of like actual legality of adultery, right? But adultery has been quote unquote legal, you know, at least in the United States. I think there's actually some places, I think Jordan was telling me, there's actually some places in Virginia where it's not. Like it's actually illegal to have an affair. But in most places in the United States, it's not against the law. That has nothing to do with whether or not it's morally right or wrong, right? Or say bearing false witness against a friend. You know, we're not talking about necessarily in a courtroom, but more in terms of like gossip and slander, right? So talking behind someone's back, you know, sort of dissing them to a coworker, things like that. Well, it's not illegal, but it's definitely not right, you know? And so once you sort of get it through your head that like we follow this Christian moral law, right? We follow what it is the Bible says and means. And it doesn't matter if that is really like, if the government says something's okay, even if it's not, well, we're called to not say it's okay because the Bible speaks on it, right? And like once you appreciate that the standard that we're held to is really the Bible more than common law, although we're bound by the laws of wherever we are, right? So Romans chapter 13, let me pull up the verses for this because these are quite relevant here today. Romans chapter 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2 both talk about submitting to government authority. So, I mean, like, I don't know if you can say it any more clearly than that, right? You know, this is Paul in Romans 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. You know, you can't wiggle outside of that. There is no room here for saying, well, what about evil, corrupt governments in the world, right? Scripture is clear. I'd say probably more in the Old Testament where God deals with groups of people. So God deals with the state of Israel as this theocracy, right, as his nation. But it's clear that the people get the rulers and the government that they deserve, right? So when Israel is straying and following idols and idolatry and paganism, then they get bad kings, right? When Israel, like the nation of Israel, like the people that compose the nation are on a spiritual upswing, that's when they get good kings, right? And they have their reforms and things like that, right? So too, has it ever been the case with groups of people? You know, the Bible in Matthew chapter 5, I think it's chapter 5, which is talking about us as salt and light, right? The remnant of true biblical Christianity is how God deals with groups of people collectively, right? You know, he blesses areas where believers are, right, for the sake of the believers. And in places where there's very little true Christianity, then they're not likely to have, you know, overt blessing by God, right? And so we're never going to escape the fact that if we are part of a country where there's very little interest in the truth, then we're just not going to have like good choices on our political ballot, right? I think somewhere on Dr. Lugan will phrase it something like, you know, like King David's not even going to be one of the options, right? Like we can't even vote for him. He's not even there. And so the choices between, you know, like evil person number one and evil person number two, well, who do you vote for? See, the problem here is that none of this escapes God's notice. It's not like God has set this up and is like, oh man, it's out of control now. You know, what do we do? Every place receives the governance that it deserves. And, you know, moreover, you know, God gives people over to the choices of their society. You know, if we read in Romans chapter 1, where, just for example, oops, that's auto-corrected there. Romans chapter 1, where Paul's talking about blah, blah, blah. Right here, Romans chapter 1, verse 24. God gave them over to their desires, essentially, right? If people are chasing after wickedness in their hearts, God will let them do it. God will let them make those choices against him, right? In fact, Ichthus has an entire study on this. Well, I don't know if you guys have ever read this one, but I think this was Dr. Luganbill's like thesis for his Hebrew degree, the Exodus 14 study that focuses on the hardening of Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah, I've read it.
You're familiar? Yeah. It's complicated because actually, not to get off topic too much, but both in the Hebrew, both phrases like God hardened Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh hardened his own heart are used, right? And this becomes a sticking point when people argue about Calvinism and free will, because they say God hardening Pharaoh's heart, like Pharaoh doesn't have a choice in that, right? But the fact that both are used, and as we see here in Romans 1, the fact that God gave them over to their own desires, right? Basically, God hardened Pharaoh's heart because Pharaoh wanted his heart to be hard, right? Is how it essentially works. But where I was going with all this was that if our society is chasing after sin headlong, like rushing after it, both arms open, well, there's not a whole lot that we can do as Christians to stop that general trajectory, right? Like we can be the good moral influence we can be in our own spheres, but as a society, on a societal level, like that's not even something we can change, right?
Which is the next question I was going to ask because of that submission. Can you go back to the submission to government authority?
Sure.
Verse?
I mean, there's Romans chapter 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2 here. So I mean, like here's Romans.
So living godly yeah. So in a case where it says because the next verse that goes after that, it says something along the lines of for they're not, you don't have to live in terror if you do good works.
That's in Romans 13.
Because that's not the role of the government. The government doesn't go the government doesn't go hard against people who do good works. They do so against people that do
Romans
evil.
13, yeah.
Yeah. So for rulers and not a terror. So if you look at verse 3 there, for rulers and not a terror, but evil. So you don't have to be unafraid of the authority. So this raises a question for me because I think this is contextualized. So what happens when you have an instance where the government is doing evil and the government supports evil?
Oh, okay.
And for one of the reasons why I asked that question is because if you might be aware, we might disagree on, and I think I know they have talked about this before too. We might disagree on his methods and some of his teachings, John MacArthur. But he took a stand. Take for instance, with regards to the understanding of the data and the reports, what certain aspects of the governments are trying to enforce all around the world. So take for instance that wearing of mask, and you're approaching summer, and then you still have to wear masks. Just something like that, and stopping the church from congregating and all of that, and then he and his church have gone up in arms, in quotes, against the government, and they're taking the government to court, or they're taking the states to court. Mm-hmm. What do you say to something like that? Are you meant to just submit?
No, I mean, here's how I always start things like this, is that you have to be internally consistent. So if we are preaching this code of sort of staying aloof from politics, letting God handle these big issues, right, which is the position that Ichthus puts forward and that, I subscribe to and teach, you have to be consistent. So, for example, there are certain uncontroversial like resistances to government authority that most people just take for granted as being good, right? Think Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement in the United States, right? Like the problem with this is if you sit there and say, well, so is peaceful like non-government compliance, right? Blocking roads and bridges and rallies and things of this sort, right? If this peaceful protest is going against the government, was the civil rights movement justified biblically? People argue about this, so some scholars at great length. So the problem is, if you are internally consistent, you have to say, if we resist government authority, like if people are doing wrong, do we have the authority as individuals to collectively gather and oppose the authority that God's put in place? You see, the authority question about this is that what's under argument is not like if Jim Crow laws and like segregation are okay or not, because they're not, right? Like, obviously, right? The question is were the means and methods used, is this how it, quote unquote, should have been?
Yes.
Now, and
just bear in mind also that the resisting the government authority is not a unilateral thing. It has instances.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah. Do you want to explain that? Do you want to explain that a little further?
Is that to me or to Stephen?
No, you.
Okay. So what I mean is, take for instance, the police brutality thing mentioned in the States and some of the clapback that they are receiving. I think we can all agree that yes, the idea of just being opposed to police authority it's kind of stupid, really, or in fact, the police are there for a reason to protect, and using one or two, three examples or incidents, using isolated incidents to generalize the good that they have done, is pretty much problematic. But that is not to say that there aren't instances where police brutality actually occurs. So, there's how do you go about opposing police authority in this case? And I did follow a couple of people, and one of the really good ones I saw, what is the role of the citizen when he's being asked questions by the cops? The rule is simply comply, get the police name, get the officer's name and badge number, and then you can go sue or contest in court. Those systems are set up in place, but basically the first rule is to comply.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
I think,
if you
Adi, you can jump in. I think part of the difficulty, this is the reason why I brought up the civil rights movement, was like, basically, if you can't have it both ways. And this is how I see a lot of Christians attempt to argue this one. If you say that we're supposed to stay out of politics, then you can't choose to selectively step into politics on certain issues just because you think that they're in the moral right. So, Adi, do you want to cut in? My stance on this, and even despite recent racial tensions and all of this, we can have our opinions on what is right and what is wrong and stuff, but we needn't feel bad staying out of politics, even so, and trusting that the chips will fall where God leads them to, and that it's simply not our responsibility to go and fix the world.
Yeah, and I would now try to answer what you asked about the rulers not being a terror to good works but to evil. There are two ways to answer that. On the one hand, there's the fact that in general, we look at everything that happens in this world as terminating at physical death, and that is not wrong, but that's not everything. For example, if you go to, I believe, Isaiah 14, and where else are we talking about now? Revelation, I believe, chapter 2 or 3. Yes, chapter 3, where the Lord is addressing Philadelphia. And he says that he'll bring these people to bow down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. In the first instance, in Isaiah 14, we're talking about kings that have already died. We actually see Satan, who is typified there by the king of Babylon, being brought down to show and they make comments about him. So what you see there is that eventually, in fact, I think Psalm 82 answers it as well as it can be answered, that God sits in the council of gods, in the council of the rulers, and he speaks to the rulers, he addresses them. They are his ministers, that's it. They're not a terror to good works. They can pretend to be, but the issue, their judgment does not cease at, for example, martyring the good person, or for example, what will happen during the tribulation when Christians are killed by earthly authorities. That's not what it ends. They will eventually have to answer to the king when he returns. And that's not all. They will still have to answer to the king when they are raised from the dead to answer to the judgment. They are not a terror to good works. The sense in which we consider them a terror is what they can do to us because of the power they have when they're opposed to the Lord. But that is not supposed to be a terror to people who love the Lord. Because if we die, we are with the Lord. If we live for the Lord. There's no terror really. Then when we consider that verse 4 actually explains that when it says, he is God's minister to you for good, because like I said, in the end, Psalm 82 demonstrates that these rulers are actually God's own deputies. Whatever they appear to do that goes contrary to God's will it does not harm the believer. Yes, you may be killed. Yes, you may be thrown into prison and deprived of your possessions and all that. But we believers know that all those things, as inconvenient and painful as they may be, they are really actually working out for good for our benefits. But if anyone, and here is the really mind-boggling thing, if anyone were to decide to go the wrong way and to do wickedness, it doesn't matter that they are actually doing wickedness under an evil ruler. The evil ruler will use exactly that pretext of wanting to uphold the law to harm anyone who's doing evil, which is exactly why politics is such a dangerous game. Lots of people get involved in the corridors of power thinking, well, I'm above the law now, I can do whatever. And then they find there's someone more powerful than them who can call into question at any time he wants something they've done wrong and use it to harm them. Even though that person who is actually doing that is being hypocritical because it's also wrong. So you have the Senate calling the EFCC chairman, for example, to answer for a lot of things. And we know that the Senate is not particularly saintly, right? But they do have the power and the right to actually make an example of someone who may be doing something wrong. So when you put yourself in the place where you say, well, the government is so bad, they have no moral right to judge me. Well, I dare you to go and do bad. That's when they'll show you their moral right to judge you.
So I don't want to straight disagree with you, Adi. I think there is a tendency for those of us who argue for staying out of politics to sometimes straw man the positions that other people are holding. Like, I think the question of what do you do when government authority is off the rails? Like, it's not just a question designed to trip people up. Like, it's a legitimate one.
It's a legitimate question, yes.
What happens
institutionalized?
What happens when you live in Nazi Germany? Stuff like that, right? Like, it's not a bogus question. Now, something that Ichthys has elsewhere, I think, that I don't think we've brought up yet, is that there's this idea of God determining nations. You know, nations were given for our benefit after the Tower of Babel, in part to always give people a place to flee to. This will cease being the case during the Great Tribulation, where there will be nowhere in the world that's safe for Christians. But nowadays, if you have a place that's very antithetical to biblical Christianity, there are countries that are not, right? This answer to what happens when my government is really wicked, well, the answer to that question, needn't always be, like be killed by the government or start a revolution. It can also be go to some place that's not so opposed to the truth.
What I have actually tried to focus on is answering this verses 3 and 4 thing about essentially what it means if rulers I mean, if rulers do evil, they're not supposed to be a terror to good works. And my answer is, if the scriptures say that they're not a terror to good works, then they really are not a terror to good works, even when they appear to be. That's what I'm saying. Now, that is not to say, therefore.
I mean, okay, I see where you're going with this, but like, so the clear version.
I was going to ask for the Greek words of terror and good works. Because
yeah, I don't think you'll find that there will be much of a difference there, but go on, Stephen.
No. Well,
because terror and good works.
I mean, what I was going to say, Audie, is that this is one of the traps that people take in absolutes. So in terms of hermeneutics, do we take this verse 3 and verse 4 here as absolutes? That is, for all people who are rulers, there is not one who is a terror to good works, but all of them categorically are, terrors to evil, but not good works. Do you see what I'm saying? Like as a set, do we put universal quantifier on this or not? Or is it just saying, like, quote unquote, as a rule of thumb, as a rule of general application? Like those are different things, right?
My conviction is that it's an absolute, because in the way I see it.
Do you see what's happening already?
What's that?
Your conviction, it's now becoming a matter of application.
No, it's not really. It's not. What I'm trying to do here is to essentially say that I don't really see that there is an argument here, but I will accommodate the fact that I could be wrong about it, but I'm not, because it's an interpretation I'm making. But I don't believe it's a wrong interpretation. When the scriptures say that rulers are not a terror to good works, and we understand, not only does it say that the rulers are not a terror to good works, it says they are not a terror to good works because they are God's minister to do good. That's what the scriptures say. My understanding of that, on the basis of everything else that I've read in the scriptures, is this: that because everyone who does good works the way that the Lord himself describes good works is ending up with the Lord. In the end, he is going to be vindicated by the Lord. There is no terror to them, no matter what the ruler does. That's where I stand on that. So even if it were the Antichrist standing up and persecuting Christianity and trying to exterminate it from the earth, I don't see that as meaning that he is a terror to good works, and therefore we are in some kind of real danger if we did good works. What I see that would happen there is, the worst that could happen is that you get killed. And if you get killed, you end up with the Lord, as long as you're a believer, which is not terror. It's
sort of in
not
line
something
with,
bad.
Like what can man do to you? Like fear not the one who can kill you, but the one who can destroy your body and soul in hell.
So I think that's an excellent passage to raise because of this. The point entirely is that there is no terror of any sort to anyone who is doing things that please the Lord. And if in the end God is going to vindicate you both by resurrection and by the destruction of those who oppose the good thing that you were doing, I don't see how there is any terror whatsoever coming to you.
So, I mean, and here is where I would, so Audie, if I can jump in for a second, the point that you've been raised in this, making Romans chapter 13, verse 3 and verse 4 an absolute, right? And there is a class of statements in Greek that are called gnomic statements, which are just like sort of like observations about, just like generalities. So like, for example, it is man's lot to work, right? Like it is basically, it's something that is, we talked about this a couple of weeks back, right? That's what human beings do, right? Like we work, like that's the lot of us. And so that's like a general statement, right? So too here, I mean, and Dottie, you can jump in and tell me what words, and specifically you said terror, right? This word here, phobos, means fear, terror. I mean, like here you go. Like what specifically you're interested in, but the way that Audie has taken the passage is in the absolute terms, right? Well, if you do this, not in terms of like the rulers have no power to like actually affect us in a negative way spiritually. Like I affirm that proposition, right?
Yes, I agree with that too.
The question is not so much like, can they harm us spiritually, but it says that they are a terror, ta agathoi ergoi, to good works, right? To, well, what exactly does that mean, right? To
What
good,
does good works mean? Yeah.
yeah. So like, does that mean that they oppose people doing the right thing? So,
Yep.
for example, in Daniel, when Daniel is praying, despite the law saying that they have to worship the emperor, right? Um, is that the good work that they are opposing? You know, I mean, so what I'm bringing up is that, can this passage, like, is it absolute in the sense that if we come up with a counterexample, we say, oh boy, scripture has been disproven, or is it just supposed to be, like a matter of general relevance, that like God knows what he's doing by putting people in power, so authority is there generally, like the role of the government. If we want to like be a little bit hand wavy in this, like the reason why God establishes governments is generally to maintain law and order, right?
Yep.
And so in general, we can say that the ruling authority is in place to, incentivize good behavior and punish evil behavior, right? Like as a
Yes.
general rule, that's true. Now, does that mean
Yes.
that there can be cases where, by all appearances, those in power seem to like be incentivizing what is evil and disincentivizing what is good, right? Like, would that be allowable in these verses if you interpret them less absolutely? So I'm going to recuse myself here a little bit. I mean, I'm just presenting this as another viewpoint, Audie, because you're arguing that what you're saying in the text is like the only way to take it, right? Like that this is.
No, I like I said, it's an interpretation, and every time we teach the scriptures, every time we teachers teach the scriptures, we're bound to be making authoritative statements about all sorts of things, but
Sure.
that does not mean that we are going to be right about them. Now, the reason I say I'm convinced is that everything I know in the scriptures persuades me that this interpretation is the correct one. That does not mean that there cannot be another correct one. It does not mean that it cannot be wrong. However, I have no reason to believe it is not the correct one. So, what I'm convinced about when it says good conduct here, I know it is not referring just to praying and reading the Bible, doing, following a pastor teaching ministry closely, basically growing spiritually and bearing fruit for the Lord. I know that the particular concern of these scriptures have to do with how we treat one another, the way that human beings live together. When you look at Genesis chapter 9,
like the things that you have to outlaw for civilization to work.
Yes, and when you look at Genesis chapter 9, where the Lord actually gave law for the first time, essentially by so doing, he instituted the very concept of government. Genesis 9 verse 5, surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning, from the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by a man his blood shall be shed. So essentially, what the Lord does here is say, I am putting the well-being of the human community into the hands of human governments. A man will be responsible for the life of the men in his community. And when we go to the law, we see the question of the avenger. If anyone were to kill, whether he does so on purpose or he does it murderously, there is an avenger. At the time, they didn't have any police force, but someone in each family or each community would actually be understood to be the one who would stand up and avenge anyone who's killed. So once the avenger was out there, hunting whoever killed the person, well, there was very little to stop him from accomplishing his vengeance, So, which was why the Lord established those cities of refuge that the killer could flee to, to escape, at least until a trial is held, something like that. So these things are essentially the ways that the Lord dissuaded lawlessness. That's how he did it. And again, it is true that a government can be wicked and evil. And we all three of us here are in full agreement. We know that the Lord deliberately institutes such authorities in several places for at least one reason that we all know of. Those places are deserving of such governments. People who, he actually talks about the Antichrist and the rulers that will serve under him, talking about them as fierce kings that he will set over his people, you know, essentially to harm them, to make life difficult for them. He himself will set them up. We have in Revelation a testimony to the fact that the Antichrist will be raised up essentially to carry out war against the saints, and that he will be given power to conquer them. This is all coming from the Lord. Why do these things end up in the scriptures like this? Because in the end, what we might perceive as evil is actually good. If the Antichrist does not arise and give the church the kind of trouble that he gives to it, there's a question whether we will ever get serious with what our duties here are. Then at the end, we also know that if he does not arise and if the tribulation does not occur, the Lord Jesus is not returning. It's as simple as that. So given these things, I'm persuaded that when the scriptures say that a ruler does not exist to, you know, as a terror to good conduct or good works, I'm persuaded that that means that whatever a ruler does in response to good conduct, it is not terrifying. It ought not to be, for the simple reason that he is God's minister and God himself does not stand against good conduct.
So what do you make of the statement later on in verse 3 that says, do what is good and you will receive his approval? So here is the pronoun in Greek, the autes, you know, is like, you know.
Let's use what's his name? Nebuchadnezzar.
Because you're thinking about this, you're coming up with this on a large scale where he and the ruler, you're thinking about the service to God ultimately, but that particular verse 3 and 4 is actually talking about the human. It is in reference to your human context and, you know, the people you have over you. That is not to say that God is still not sovereign. I totally agree with that. You know what I mean? But, you know,
well, it's just so the way that you're framing things, Audie, with this, you know, like rulers cannot ultimately harm us spiritually, right? So even no matter what they do, it's for our spiritual good. Like I'm not disagreeing with that sentiment. It's just I'm not so sure that that's what this verse has in mind.
That verse is talking about,
when we have this here, that's talking about like the ruler will like basically approve. If you do what is good, the ruler will approve that. Like there's plenty of places in history where if you do what is good, the ruler will not approve it. Like, so what does this mean according to this interpretation that rulers are not ultimately like spiritually harmful? You know, it just seems to me like the common sense reading of this passage.
Okay, what seems to you like the common sense reading of the passage?
I think it's good that we all agree on one thing for starters. That those are in place as a general rule of thumb. The general rule of thumb being rulers are not a terror to good conduct.
Yeah.
Like if we were just to take that literally, we can agree with that statement, rulers not being a terror to good conduct but to bad. But this is human specific. You know, we're not trying to, it's not like I'm in disagreement of, you know, what you say about harming us spiritually. Of course, I totally agree with that. But your human counterparts, the people set to rule over you, would always, as a general rule of thumb, you know, they would reward good works. And so evil people or people who do wrong have to live in fear of those authorities. However, there are exceptions to the rule where your rulers are in fact evil and corrupt, or the person set over you is evil and corrupt. And I do like, I will say that, you know, I agree with that statement of, you know, fleeing to another place. And we could see instances where the disciples did that. But then what other examples are out there for Christians to follow? Because if you're fleeing, you're running away from a ruler and authority that you consider evil, that doesn't recognize good works. And Odi, you and I know this all too well because it's practically one of the things even you are trying to do right now.
Yeah, of course. I've been mentioning this part of the Bible for a while. I think that it may be actually useful for us to look at it. Psalm chapter 82, so that it might say something that will help to explain this. So this is the Lord actually sitting in what the scriptures call the divine council. He's actually addressing human rulers here. How long will you judge unjustly? So we know that the scriptures actually know that that the rulers can be unjust. So how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the rights of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked, which, of course, once you go back to Romans 13, you see that this is exactly what the scriptures say, that they exist to protect the good from the evil ones among us. So he says to them, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. We know that this is essentially saying, even if I have made you rulers, I will remove you and I will vindicate those that you have actually dealt with unjustly and shown partiality to. It's not wrong to say that that's a rule of thumb, you know. It's not wrong. I don't think it is. But I also don't think that that is what Romans 8 is saying. The rule of thumb is that rulers exist essentially to restrain wickedness in a land, lawlessness in a land, and also encourage righteousness and decency. That's something that we know is true. We also know that the rulers of this world are not even close to perfect, much less, they're barely good, much less close to perfect. We know that. So, but here, this is what the scriptures are telling us. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And once you read something like this, it should call to mind something else. James chapter 1 tells us that every good and perfect gift comes from God, from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow of turning. That's what we learn from there. So we can understand that if there is no authority except from God, then this authority is good, which is a very weird thing to say about the authorities of this world, that they are in any sense good. Yet, that's what the scriptures tell us here, unless we're willing to believe that there is anything evil that can come from them. When we say evil, I don't mean that the Lord cannot cause disaster. The scriptures are very clear. I do good and I create disaster as well. That's what the scriptures actually say.
But I think, you see, you're making this all propositional and philosophical. Like, so are we to say that natural disasters come from God, and are natural disasters good?
Well, they absolutely do. They absolutely do. The scriptures are very clear about that in Isaiah 45 verse 7, that both good things, that is things that actually are, shall I say, beneficial physically to our lives, and things that are harmful to our lives physically, all come from the Lord. We know that. I form the light, I create darkness, I create prosperity.
So I mean, like, we have to be careful when we declare the origin of evil things, right? That essential origin is not from God.
One thing is obvious. One thing I think is obvious, and I don't think we even need to raise that here. All forms of rebellion do not originate with the Lord, for the simple reason that the Lord cannot rebel against himself. However, having said that, we know that everything that may seem to be untoward, and in fact is, all judgment, every painful thing that happens in the world is an answer to the moral wickedness in the universe. That's what we know for sure. And it comes from the hand of the Lord. And we know that because of this, even rulers that are evil come from the Lord as a judgment upon people. We know that. And that is a good thing too. So therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. So if the Lord has given an evil ruler to a place in order to judge that place, and you resist that ruler, you're essentially saying that God is making a mistake in what he is doing, which is a very foolish stance to take. Now, we go forward and we say those who resist judgment.
I would like for us to revisit this next week. I will CC you on an email to Dr. Lugenbaum. I'm quite curious.
I am as well, because Adi
hold up the question.
Yeah.
So here's one of the translations. This is from SR 4, Truth Belly Part 4, which is talking about Satan's world system. Right?
Yeah.
If you read this paragraph, right, this is a translation of the first 5 verses in Romans chapter 13. Seems to me like this is very much more a like general, like this is what the verse generally means, right? And the general meaning is that yes, obviously governments, like we're being hand wavy here, but governments are set up to prevent gross evil. Like this is like social contract theory type stuff, right? Like you have to outlaw murder and rape and like institutionalize marriage and the protection of property and things like this just for civilization to work. And that's what these verses are getting at, more or less. And so that when governments go off the rails and the government starts seizing private businesses and putting people to death and things like this, that like it's I mean I don't want to say this is like directly against the absolute stance, but it seems to me like how things are phrased here is much more about like the general purpose of government. But I'm not so convinced that I want to like stake my flag down in opposition. It's just I think this is something that merits more discussion. So I'll CC you guys on.
I'll finish what I'm saying though, and I would look forward to that email.
Yeah.
Perhaps it might even sort of polish up what I'm saying for me as well, so that I actually understand a few things more. However, what I'm saying is this: it's not therefore that a government that's doing something wrong, like permitting all sorts of wickedness in the land, is a good government. It is simply a good reward from the Lord upon a society that is doing evil.
But let me see if the things I just don't understand your position on how you can say in such a case, how can you say that, to go back to our verse here, that those rulers are not a terror to good works and are a terror?
Yeah, the answer,
in those circumstances, I just don't see how, like that statement, I just don't see how it works.
Yes, so let me see if I can explain that again. I've already told you how it works on one level, which is that ultimately nothing they do is actually going to be harmful to anyone who is working with the Lord, which is the context of what Romans 13 is about. Even though yes, the address what Romans 13 talks about right here can be applied to good conduct irrespective of your spiritual inclination, which means you're not a rapist, you're not a murderer, you're not a thief and all that stuff, even if you're not a believer. There is also the fact that this is speaking to believers specifically who are often targets of these governments. That's the point of this whole thing that is being spoken of here, so that the good works that are spoken of should be understood to be more along the lines of the good works that believers ought to be doing, which is more than just not being a rapist, not being a murderer, paying your taxes and all that stuff. Yes, these things are in the context, but that's not all that Paul is actually talking about. Now, if you are someone who is doing what is good, which is what the scriptures teach us to do, you're growing spiritually and you're doing the things you ought to be doing, you're growing in the faith and you're actually bearing fruit for the Lord. If this is what you're doing, then ultimately rulers are not harmful to you. They're no terror to you. Whatever they do to you, you will actually come back from. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. Having said that, the other level of things here is that it would take a very remarkable situation for a ruler to look at a man who is law-abiding and put him to death. Now, it does not mean it doesn't happen. I mean, in the days of Israel, Ahab did it. He murdered Naboth on false pretext in order to acquire his vineyard. That happened. But do you realize that there is a reason that such things are very rarely heard, even in the world of today? Which is precisely why I said that the authority of the ruler is such that anyone who says, well, the government is such a wicked government, they don't have any moral right to judge me, and they go after doing wrong because, well, after all, the government is also wrong, is going to find themselves in a position where the government will take up the real authority, the real power that they have, and come after the criminal, even though the government is corrupt. That's why I said that there is no true terror.
I agree in some part with that. Yes. I agree in some part with that. It's like the excuse of, you're meant to pay a tax. You're meant, as a citizen, you're meant to pay
taxes. And you say, okay, cool, you don't pay taxes, and you know everything seems good for a while, but that accrues, and eventually when the government comes against you, they come against you hard because they have a legal right
The
to do
argument
so.
you're making, Audie, correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially like, let's say that you have corrupt government officials that extort money, right? So they charge you 20% for taxes. The state actually only gets 15%. They skim 5% off the top, right? If you just stopped paying taxes altogether because you know that they're skimming taxes off the top, then even the corrupt government officials would come after you and make you pay taxes, right?
Absolutely, because their authority is real and it comes from the Lord.
Right, but it's because of their self-interest and they want to continue extorting money. I mean, like, so
Extorting-
I want us to put a pause on this. It's getting late for you. I will create an email. In fact, I won't even post this video until we get this question more.
Okay, cool.
And so we'll pause this for a second. We'll come back next week and keep talking. It's an important.
I'll do some reading. A couple of things are coming up as well, like some articles I've read and all of that. So I'll post that along within the week.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Great.
That's something, but it will be great to hear Logan Bill's view on this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
right.
when
we'll
you
leave it at that for now.
type up the email,
we'll come back and touch this again next week, and hopefully, be a little bit more certain of ourselves at that point in time.
Okay.
Okay.